thing I had to work on was getting this compressor motor on the passenger side. And as with everything else on this project, it wasn't just a wham bam easy installation. Things had to be modified. So the first thing I did was I wanted to get a bracketry that will put it on the passenger side. So I got one of these. Now there was two choices. There was one offered from Vintage Air, or there's the Allen Grove unit, but basically they're both the same. They basically put the compressor off to the side, and so when it gets pushed over to the side, well, the compressor gets pushed all the way to this side. And now you know why the battery was in the way, because the compressor bracketry would bring it all the way over there. So that's why the battery had to go into the trunk. Now, because I had the alternator on the bottom, well, that created a little bit of a challenge, because the bracketry does use the two bolts on the head as well as the water pump bolt, and the bracketry for the alternator also uses the bolt for the head, but it uses this bolt. So I had to figure out a way to get both the alternator bracket and the new compressor motor bracket to join, so that I won't have a problem with the installation of both units on this side. Now normally, if you want the compressor on this side, you have to put the alternator on the other side with a similar bracket that looks exactly like the one for the compressor, but instead it's for the alternator and it goes on this side. Well, as I stated earlier, I have too much stuff on this side and I didn't want the alternator on this side. I wanted the alternator here, under the compressor. So I had to do some work to get that done. So here's basically what the setup is supposed to look like. You're supposed to put the compressor on this side and the alternator on the other side. And there's two ways to mount the alternator on this side. You could use something similar to stock, which will mount it close to the block, or you can get either the Steel Ease bracketry from Vintage Air or the Allen Grove bracketry, which is the same, and it would be exactly the same as the compressor bracket, but it would put the alternator up here, right around here, so that it'll be in line with each other. Now, why is this important? Why am I showing you this? Oh, the reason is the way the belts route. Now, when you have the compressor on this side, the belt is supposed to route to the crankshaft and the water pump, and then over to the compressor again. Now, the way I had it before, since I had the alternator down here, well, the alternator was routed similar to the way it is right now, but it would go around the crankshaft, the water pump, and back to the alternator. Well, when you install this bracketry onto this side of the engine, well, this belt goes in line with the alternator, and that creates a problem, because there is no way you can route the belt all the way around the compressor, water pump, and crankshaft and at the same time be able to put tension on the alternator. It just won't happen. So I had to figure out how to do it, and it took me all day to figure it out, with a lot of trial and error and a lot of modification. Well, I got it, and I will show you the end result. I'm not going to show you the actual process in which I took to make it, but I will try to explain it the best I can. Basically, this is the pulley that will be used to route for these two. Okay, so this is right here. Well, after doing the initial routing, I noticed that I have another pulley. Well, this compressor, lucky me, I can use or utilize this pulley to operate my alternator. So basically, the way it is set up when you first put it all together, or when I first put it all together, this was in line with the alternator. So the solution is move the alternator back so that it utilizes this pulley. So the pulley would only go, the belt would only go from the compressor to the alternator. But the pulley for the compressor will be powered by the crankshaft and the water pump. And so that's what I wanted to do, and that is the solution I had to come up with.
So looking at my pulley system, you'll see that this is the one that I'm going to be using, which was previously used for the alternator, but will now be used for the compressor motor. And I can't use that because obviously because of the bracketry and stuff and the way it's set up, well, that one's being taken up by the power steering pump. So I needed to have the belt isolated, and well, with the way I calculated and you know, with playing around with the bracketry and modifying it, I'm able to get the power I need to power the alternator through the compressor. Now, because I already did all the modifications, I'm going to have to just show you the things that I did in order to make this work. Now, the first thing I had to do was right here on the engine block, you'll notice that I had to notch the actual engine block in order to get this work. This notch will clear for the alternator's new position, and that's the first modification. The second modification was I had to actually make another cut, but on the actual head of the engine. And basically these notches are just to clear certain parts of the alternator, because now the alternator is a lot closer to the engine block. So those are the first two. I made a notch over here and a notch over here. So now I'm going to install the bracket and show you another modification I had to do in order to get this alternator close to the engine block. Now here's the first bracket attached to the engine. The second modification that had to be done was this bolt here, I had to shave down the head. So you see how thin it is. Now I didn't have to shave it down that thin, but I did have to shave it down. So that head is just basically support for this bracketry. The majority of the support will come from this screw, which obviously this is not the screw that's going to be used. This screw is going to be replaced with a 5-inch long screw that will be holding the actual alternator in place, and that force will be applied all the way through the alternator and through these spacers, and it will be attached to the block. This one is just there to basically hold it in place. Now I will put it tight, but I'm going to put some Loctite on the screw so that it doesn't come off. I cannot put a lock washer because the whole point in cutting this head down was to make clearance for the alternator's new position, which is in 3/4 of an inch more, so that it can reach the other pulley on the compressor. Now with the bracket installed, you can see why I had to make that notch. So it's actually in line with the bracketry. And in the other one, the other notch is right there. And I'll show you why I had to make those notches. Now the alternator also had to be modified. Basically, just one little modification. There's a little part here that was sticking out. I guess it's supposed to be another one of these, but there was nothing there. It was just empty. So this cutout here, I had to actually cut off. You can see it's completely cut off. I cut that off and made way for the portion of the block. So this clears that portion of the block. The one on the head, the cutout I made for the head, is to clear this. Basically this round portion of the alternator. So with those cutouts on the block, I'd be able to fit the alternator so that it clears both areas. So that's why those cutouts were made. Those was one of the modifications I had to figure out with the constant. I mean, I must have put this alternator in and taken it out maybe about, I don't know, 25 times with the amount of you know, modification cuts I had to make. I mean, I would cut little by little and then put the alternator back and then take it off, and it was just a hassle. So those are one of the first modifications. Now we move over to this modification. This was the major headache from the mod, and I will have to show you another bracket that I had to modify just because I had to modify this one. Now as you can see from the little lines, I had to install a couple plates, basically 3/4 inch plates, in order to make up the difference of the 3/4 I needed to put this alternator in line where I need it. And basically
The bracket, it's supposed to be right here in line with the first plate. But what I did was I cut it off completely and I installed another bracket, which was actually the original bracket from the alternator on the Nova, and I actually welded it on. And then, of course, made my cuts. You can see my nice handiwork there. And did a full entire weld. Basically everything you see on the bottom and the front here is all basically weld. And I just grinded it down so that way I get this shape. And I'll put it on the car so that you can see what it basically was intended. Now, in order to get this bracket perfectly aligned with what I was trying to do, I needed to also install two washers. Basically, they're about 1/16 of an inch thick. And basically, it was actually necessary to install the washers to get the alignment needed for this bracketry, and of course my modification. So you can imagine how much trial and error I had to do to get the bracket to fit and make it so that it's in line with the compressor. So here is the bracket installed, and basically you can see how it's supposed to be. This is supposed to be in line with that one, but now it's moved over closer towards the engine block. Now whatever I do to the top, I need to do to the bottom, and in order for me to do that, I needed to use a spacer. And here are the spaces, and basically just a 3/4 inch spacer is what I needed to get the clearance I needed. Now all these spacers except for one of them came with the kit. This one right here did not. This one came with the alternator kit, the original spacer, and what I had to do was just cut it down to 2.5 inches so that I can get the spacer needed for the new alternator position. And the reason why I had to cut it down to 2.5 is because now I have a bracket in the place. Basically the spacer was to go from the alternator, here would be the alternator, and then the spacer all the way to the block. But because of the modification, because I'm adding a bracket, well, I needed to cut the spacer down. So now I installed the alternator, and I'm going to show you why I made those cuts. Here you can see the cut for the engine block on the head. That's the cut I made for the head, and that was to bypass this portion of the alternator, as you can see, and also to make sure that the positive battery cable is nowhere near the engine block, because if they both touched, that would be very bad. So I got the clearance I needed for that, and I'll show you the other one. The other clearance that I made was for the engine block, and you can see there, and that was to make sure that the alternator body does not touch the engine block. Now you notice I cut a lot. Now originally when I was making these modifications and doing the test fittings, I had thought that I would have to adjust the alternator body to get the tension on the belt. But after mocking up the compressor motor, I realized that the alternator body has to remain stationary in order for me to put tension on the belt. Why? And that is because the tension for the alternator and the water pump belt has to be applied at the same time. So if I make the alternator completely stationary, that would allow me to put tension on both belts at the same time. So when I get my measurements for the belts, I will put the bracketry in such a way so that I can get an inch or 1.5 inches of tension, and then take measurements for the belts I need, and then pick from the belts that are available for the measurements that I get for the belts. So now the bottom of the alternator, you can see the bracket there, and so I have here the alternator, and I got a screw that was long enough. I wanted to make sure that it protrudes because I'm going to lock down the alternator from both sides. So I have tension on this side, and I'm going to put a screw on the other side so that I ensure that the tension is never lost and that my alternator will remain completely stationary. So that's it. So now I install the other bracketry.
Now the other bracket that has to be installed is this one here, along with the adjustment bracket for the compressor motor. So this bracket was the other one I had to modify because I made modifications to the one under it. Now because they run so close, you can see that this bracket's supposed to be straight across, but yet I have a nice long notch in this one. And the reason why I made that notch is so that it bypasses that. And then you'll notice that this notch actually curves outward, and that was also to provide clearance. I didn't want to cut this down, nor wanted to cut too much off of this, so I did a little bit on both. I cut them both down so that they clear each other. So I'm going to install it now, and I'll show you the clearance. Well, here it is. There's a compressor installed with all the bracketry. Before I get into the brackets, let me show you how the belts are positioned. I have a wrench, a pipe wrench, putting tension on the belt, so that way I can show you the belt running across the two pulleys. This is the old belt that was on previously, and basically you can see how nice and straight that is. There's the alternator pulley, and here is the second bank for the compressor pulley. And then you have here this ruler that is going to simulate the pulley that's going from the crankshaft to the water pump to the compressor, and you can see how nice and parallel that is, nice and straight. So now the way the alternator is going to get its power, it's going to get its power from the compressor, and the compressor with the alternator together is going to get its power from the crankshaft and water pump. And then of course the other belt still goes to the power steering pump, so that remains unchanged. But now you can see, let me remove this now. Now you can see all, let me just remove the other as well, the other belt, so that way I can show you what I did. Here's all the bracketry. Now you can see, let's see if I can get the camera. There's the clearance I was talking about. That's what I wanted when I made that notch. And then for the clearance on the side, you can see right there, and if I put the light in the back, you can see that there's light being shined from under. So you can see there's light running on the bottom. So there's clearance all the way around for that bracket against the alternator bracket. That's why I had to make those modifications. You can also see how thick this is and why I had to make that the way I did, so that I can move the alternator back. See, this would focus there. That's 3/4 of an inch. So there it is. Got the alternator in the back. I have my clearance needed. The plug is still there, and it's all aligned beautifully. I'm very happy with the results, and you can see now where the actual compressor pulley section of the compressor is in relation to where the battery was originally. So you can see why I needed to remove the battery and put it in the trunk. So it was definitely a necessity. But the cool thing is that I can see all the chrome. I can see my compressor, and I can see the alternator in between all that red. That just looks awesome. So I'm very happy with the results. It's coming together really nice. So now I can concentrate on routing my lines to where they need to go. The two AC compressor lines. One of them will come through the firewall to the condenser, and the other one will go in through the fender down to inside the car. So there it is. Hope you enjoyed. Thank you for watching.